The Iron Throne has a new ruler, but winning the throne was never the hardest part. Keeping it is. By the end of episode 1, Queen Rhaenyra finally sat where she believed she always belonged. Yet instead of peace, every victory has only created new enemies. The Greens may have lost King's Landing, but the war is far from over. Aemond is still alive, Vhagar is still flying, Aegon has disappeared, and somewhere beyond the battlefield, old prophecies are beginning to matter more than swords. Episode 2 quietly plants the seeds for what could become one of the bloodiest chapters in House of the Dragon. Hidden clues, subtle dialogue, and shocking callbacks don't just explain what's happening now. They also connect directly to the future of the Targaryen dynasty and even the events of Game of Thrones. Let's break down every major moment, every hidden detail, and every connection you may have missed. Episode 2 opens with something that has become a pattern throughout the series. Every time someone believes they have gained complete control, the story immediately reminds us that power in Westeros never stays in one pair of hands for long. Rhaenyra now occupies the Red Keep, but instead of celebrating, she finds herself surrounded by uncertainty. The throne she fought so hard to claim feels colder than ever. This mirrors something King Viserys once said long before the Dance of the Dragons truly began. He believed the Iron Throne was never simply a chair. It was a burden that slowly consumed everyone who sat upon it. Looking at Rhaenyra now, we begin to understand exactly what he meant. One of the most interesting details in this episode is how empty King's Landing feels. The city has changed rulers, yet the people show very little excitement. Instead, fear dominates every street. This is a reminder that common people rarely care which dragon sits on the throne. They only care about surviving. That same frustration would eventually explode years later during one of the most tragic events in Targaryen history. The hatred ordinary people develop toward dragons during the dance becomes one of the biggest reasons these magnificent creatures almost disappear forever. Rhaenyra's small council also reveals something important. Although everyone appears loyal, cracks are already beginning to form beneath the surface. Some advisors push for mercy, believing the realm needs healing after so much bloodshed. Others argue that showing mercy now would only encourage rebellion. This disagreement perfectly reflects one of the central themes George R.R. Martin has explored throughout his stories. A ruler constantly faces impossible choices where every decision creates another enemy. There is rarely a perfect answer. Daemon, meanwhile, remains one of the most unpredictable figures in the entire war. Even after helping Rhaenyra take King's Landing, it becomes clear that he views problems differently than everyone else. While others discuss politics, Daemon thinks only about ending the conflict through overwhelming force. This difference between husband and wife creates subtle tension throughout the episode. Neither openly challenges the other, but every conversation hints that they see the future in completely different ways. It raises an important question. Can two people truly rule together when they disagree on how power should be used? Another fascinating detail involves Harrenhal. Even though the castle appears distant from the main conflict, the episode continues treating it almost like a living character. Fans of Game of Thrones already know Harrenhal carries an infamous reputation. Generation after generation, every powerful family that controls the castle suffers terrible misfortune. Whether you believe this comes from magic or simply history repeating itself, the curse surrounding Harrenhal continues influencing events. The writers repeatedly draw attention to its dark atmosphere, suggesting the castle still has a major role to play before the war ends. The episode also spends time following Aemond, who remains one of the most dangerous players despite losing King's Landing. Many viewers focus only on his military strength, but his greatest weapon is actually his patience. Unlike many warriors, Aemond rarely acts out of panic. Every defeat teaches him something new. Riding Vhagar, the oldest and most experienced dragon alive, he understands that wars are not won in a single battle. They are won by waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. That mindset makes him even more terrifying than before. There is also an interesting parallel between Aemond and another famous Targaryen from Game of Thrones. Much like Daenerys later learns, controlling dragons does not automatically mean controlling the realm. Dragons can destroy castles, but they cannot force people to remain loyal forever. The show quietly reminds us that political victories often matter more than military ones. One of the episode's most subtle moments comes when characters discuss loyalty. Throughout House of the Dragon, loyalty has never been permanent. Lords swear oaths, then abandon them when circumstances change. Families switch sides to protect their own futures. Even close friendships collapse under political pressure. This reflects a harsh truth about Westeros. Survival almost always comes before honor. We saw this countless times in Game of Thrones, from the betrayals of the War of the Five Kings to the shifting alliances that eventually placed Bran Stark upon the throne. Perhaps the biggest hidden connection arrives through continued references to Aegon's prophetic dream, the Song of Ice and Fire. At first, this prophecy seemed disconnected from the Civil War. After all, the White Walkers will not appear for another century and a half. Yet, every reminder tells us that while the Targaryens destroy each other fighting for power, they slowly forget the very reason their family conquered Westeros in the first place. By the time Game of Thrones begins, almost nobody even remembers the prophecy existed. The knowledge has been buried beneath generations of bloodshed, betrayal, and lost history. And that may be the greatest tragedy of the Dance of the Dragons. The Targaryens are so consumed by fighting one another that they fail to protect the future they were always meant to defend. Episode 2 quietly reinforces this idea, reminding us that every victory today may actually be creating the downfall of tomorrow. The throne may finally belong to Rhaenyra, but the cost of keeping it is only beginning to reveal itself. As the episode continues, the story shifts away from the throne itself and begins focusing on something even more dangerous: trust. One lesson has been repeated throughout both House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. Kingdoms rarely fall because of powerful enemies. They fall because the people closest to the ruler stop trusting one another. Episode 2 quietly builds that tension, showing that even after taking King's Landing, Rhaenyra's greatest battle may be against doubt inside her own court. One of the strongest examples comes from the growing divide between experienced lords and the newer supporters who earn their place through the war. Everyone agrees they want victory, but nobody agrees on how to achieve it. Some believe the Blacks should immediately hunt down Aemond before he can rebuild his army. Others argue that the realm needs stability first, because another dragon battle could destroy everything they have just won. This disagreement may seem like ordinary politics, but history tells us these small arguments often become the beginning of much larger betrayals. The episode also reminds us that dragons are no longer symbols of hope. Earlier in Targaryen history, seeing a dragon inspired awe. Now, every time one appears in the sky, ordinary people expect death to follow. This is a massive shift in public perception, and it directly connects to one of the biggest events that will shape the future of Westeros. Fear is replacing admiration, and once people begin fearing dragons more than they fear their rulers, the balance of power starts changing forever. Another detail many viewers may overlook is how often the camera lingers on the Iron Throne itself. The throne almost feels like another character watching every conversation. George R.R. Martin has often described the Iron Throne as something that rejects unworthy rulers. Whether you believe the throne is cursed or simply symbolic, it constantly reminds every king and queen that ruling is supposed to be painful. Nobody sits comfortably on the Iron Throne for very long, and Episode 2 continues reinforcing that idea without ever needing to say it directly. Meanwhile, Aemond's storyline grows even more fascinating. After losing the capital, many would expect him to become reckless, but instead he becomes more calculated. That restraint makes him incredibly dangerous. Throughout Game of Thrones, we saw commanders like Robb Stark and Stannis Baratheon win battles through brilliant strategy, only to lose everything because of one emotional decision. Aemond appears determined not to repeat those mistakes. Every move he makes feels patient, almost as if he is waiting for Rhaenyra to make the first major mistake. His connection with Vhagar also deserves attention. Vhagar is not simply the largest dragon alive. She is a living piece of Targaryen history. She once carried Rhaenyra Targaryen during Aegon's conquest, meaning this dragon has witnessed the rise of the dynasty from the very beginning. Every battle Vhagar survives is another reminder that dragons remember wars long after humans are gone. In many ways, Vhagar represents the old Targaryen Empire, refusing to disappear. Episode 2 also quietly expands the importance of prophecy. Some viewers may think these references exist only to connect House of the Dragon with Game of Thrones, but they actually serve a much deeper purpose. The prophecy, known as the Song of Ice and Fire, creates an incredible irony. While everyone fights over who deserves the throne today, the real enemy that threatens humanity still lies in the distant future. Every dragon lost during the dance weakens the very family that was meant to stand against the long night. This makes one subtle conversation especially meaningful. Several characters speak about legacy rather than victory. That distinction matters because victory only lasts for a moment, while legacy shapes generations. Viserys believed he was protecting his family's future by naming Rhaenyra heir. Instead, his decision unintentionally sparked the civil war that would nearly destroy House Targaryen forever. Episode 2 repeatedly asks whether even the best intentions can lead to disaster. The growing importance of the Rivellins is another clue that shouldn't be ignored. At first glance, these castles seem less significant than King's Landing or Dragonstone. However, anyone familiar with Westerosi history knows the Rivellins have always become the center of major conflicts. During Robert's Rebellion, the War of the Five Kings, and now the Dance of the Dragons, armies repeatedly march across the same lands. It is almost as if history keeps dragging every generation back to the same battlefield. The episode also continues exploring the psychological cost of war. Characters who once spoke with confidence now hesitate before making decisions. Some struggle to sleep, while others become increasingly isolated. These moments may seem small, but they reflect one of George R.R. Martin's greatest strengths as a writer. His stories are never just about battles. They are about how violence changes people from the inside. Winning a war often means losing parts of yourself that can never be recovered. One particularly interesting connection to Game of Thrones comes through the idea of inherited conflict. Just as the children of Ned Stark were forced to suffer because of decisions made by earlier generations, the younger Targaryens are paying the price for choices made long before they were born. They inherit not only crowns and dragons, but also grudges, rivalries, and impossible expectations. Westeros has always been a world where children carry the burdens of their parents. Perhaps the biggest hidden message in Episode 2 is that the Dance of the Dragons is beginning to reach a point where nobody can truly win. Every victory creates another tragedy. Every alliance demands another sacrifice. Every dragon that survives the next battle only increases the destruction waiting in the battle after that. The war has become larger than any single king or queen. By the end of this part of the episode, it becomes clear that the struggle is no longer simply between the blacks and the greens. It has become a fight between destiny and ambition. Some characters still believe they can control the future through strength, while others are beginning to realize that prophecy, history, and human pride are pushing everyone toward a conclusion that may already be impossible to avoid. And if that is true, then Episode 2 isn't just moving the story forward. It is quietly preparing us for some of the most heartbreaking moments the entire series has yet to deliver. As Episode 2 reaches its final act, the story becomes much less about armies and much more about consequences. One of the biggest themes running through House of the Dragon has always been that every choice creates a chain reaction. A single decision made today may not reveal its true cost until years later. That is exactly what makes this episode so fascinating. It doesn't rely on constant action. Instead, it quietly places every major character onto a path that feels impossible to escape. One of the most interesting details is how often characters speak about winning the war, while almost nobody talks about rebuilding the kingdom afterward. This is a mistake we have seen many times throughout the history of Westeros. Robert Baratheon won his rebellion but struggled to rule. Robb Stark kept winning battles until politics caught up with him. Daenerys conquered cities across Essos, yet holding power proved far more difficult than taking it. Episode 2 reminds us that claiming a throne is only the beginning. Governing a broken kingdom is an entirely different challenge. Rhaenyra herself seems to understand this better than ever before. Although she finally wears the crown, there is very little satisfaction on her face. Instead, Every new report forces another impossible decision. Should she punish those who serve the Greens? Should she forgive them in hopes of creating peace? Should she chase Aemond immediately, or secure the capital first? None of these choices come with a perfect outcome. No matter what she decides, someone will believe she has made the wrong choice. That uncertainty is exactly what slowly destroys great rulers throughout George R. Martin's world. The strongest kings are not always defeated by enemy swords. Many are defeated by exhaustion, doubt, and the weight of responsibility. We watched this happen to Viserys over many years. We saw hints of it in Robert Baratheon. Even Jon Snow struggled with it after becoming king in the north. Leadership in Westeros is rarely glorious. More often, it is lonely. Meanwhile, Aemond continues proving why he remains one of the most unpredictable characters in the series. Unlike many villains, he does not see himself as evil. In his own mind, he is protecting his family's claim and restoring what was stolen from them. That perspective makes him much more dangerous because he believes every ruthless decision is justified. Throughout both House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, the most frightening characters have always been those who genuinely believe they are doing the right thing. Another subtle detail involves the remaining dragons themselves. Earlier in the season, dragons represented overwhelming strength. Now, they increasingly feel like ticking time bombs. Every dragon battle weakens both sides, regardless of who wins. Each loss pushes House Targaryen closer to the extinction we already know is coming. This creates dramatic irony for longtime fans. We already know that by the time Daenerys Targaryen is born, dragons have become nothing more than legends. Watching this war unfold feels like witnessing the slow collapse of an entire civilization. This also creates one of the strongest connections to Game of Thrones. Daenerys often believed dragons would restore the greatness of House Targaryen. But House of the Dragon shows us the opposite side of that history. Dragons did not only build the dynasty, they also helped destroy it. The same creatures that united the Seven Kingdoms eventually became weapons in a family civil war. That contradiction lies at the heart of the entire story. The episode also plants several clues that suggest loyalty across Westeros is becoming increasingly fragile. Some houses remain publicly committed to one side while secretly preparing for another outcome. Others simply wait to see who gains the advantage before declaring their support. Fans of Game of Thrones will recognize this pattern immediately. Families like the Freys, the Boltons, and even some of the great houses survived by adapting to changing political winds rather than remaining loyal to a single cause. One hidden theme that deserves more attention is legacy. Nearly every major character believes they are fighting to protect their family's future, yet their actions often accomplish the exact opposite. This irony defines the dance of the dragons. Fathers try to secure their children's inheritance. Mothers fight to defend their bloodline. Brothers seek revenge for old wounds. But each battle leaves the next generation with less than the one before it. There are also quiet reminders that history in Westeros moves in cycles. Kingdoms rise, powerful families fall, forgotten prophecies return, and new rulers repeat the mistakes of those who came before them. House of the Dragon is not simply telling the story of one civil war. It is explaining why the Seven Kingdoms eventually become so divided by the time of Game of Thrones. Every betrayal, every dragon lost, and every broken alliance leaves scars that remain visible more than a century later. Perhaps the biggest takeaway from Episode 2 is that destiny and choice continue to collide. Characters believe they control their own future, yet prophecy, ambition, pride, and fear constantly push them toward the same tragic destination. The closer they move toward victory, the closer they come to destroying everything they claim to love. That is the cruel genius of the Dance of the Dragons. There are heroes on both sides, there are villains on both sides, and in the end, almost everyone pays a terrible price. As we look ahead to Episode 3, several questions become impossible to ignore. Where will Aemond make his next move? Can Rhaenyra truly unite a kingdom still divided by fear and resentment? Will Daemon continue standing beside the Queen, or will his own ambitions once again shape the course of the war? And perhaps most importantly, How many more dragons must fall before House Targaryen realizes that the greatest threat to their dynasty was never an outside enemy, but themselves? One thing is becoming clearer with every episode. This war is no longer about who deserves the Iron Throne. It is about who will still be standing when the flames finally die out. And if history has taught us anything, the throne may survive the dance of the dragons, but the family that built it never truly will.